Hello, I'm Robin Laney from the Open University. Welcome to the Open University. My talk today is on AI and music, and I've been joined by Byron Deuck from the music department, who's kindly agreed to play the piano for us. I should just say right at the start that this session is being recorded, so please bear that in mind. So we're going to be thinking about AI and music, and in particular the question of whether a computer can make music in a creative way. An alternative scenario is where the computer is used as a computer's assistant. So I also want to think about that today. So we're going to start with a piece of human music, quite a short piece, but a very interesting piece. And why are we doing this? Well, we're going to see what we're up against, what is the challenge for the computer. So we're going to have a performance of Bach's Invention Number 1 in C, and it's going to be performed by Byron Deuck from the music department. Byron, are you ready?
Sure, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Byron. That's fantastic. Thank you. So what I want to think about now are just the first 7 notes of this invention. Byron, could you just play the first 7 notes, please? Thank you. So what we can see, I've tried to represent these 7 notes in a diagram, and what we can see is even in this very short section of the music, we have some structure. So if we look at the diagram, we see we start with a gently rising section, and then we have a tumbling fall. So it's very easy to kind of describe that conceptually. So we have an interesting pattern there. Now, these 7 notes then are very important, not just because they're the first thing we hear, but because Bach actually bases much of the rest of the piece on this pattern of notes. What he does in effect is he copies this pattern many times and manipulates it in many different ways. So there's a sense, if we say, well, what is Bach inventing here? Why is it called an invention? We could say a lot of what he invents is this pattern. And then the rest of the piece is about repeating this pattern in very creative ways. So this goes some way to explaining why, even though there's so much going on in this very, very short piece, why we have such a coherent feel to the piece. And this contrasts with a lot of computer music. A lot of computer music can seem very, very kind of random. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to think about how can we make music using computers? And I'm going to look at 2 approaches, and in each approach, what I want to do is see if we can learn from Bach. So we're going to just take the start of the invention, and short sections of music like this, we're going to refer in this talk to as phrases. So we've got a short phrase here of notes. And if we look at this, this is far from random. So what Bach does is he chooses to work with a small set of notes, and he reuses some of those notes. So we see the C is reused at the end, the D is reused, the E is reused, and F is the only note that occurs once. And for music like Bach's, this reusing notes is very important. It's one of the things that gives the music the feel it has. So I want to see if we can learn from what Bach's done here. So I'm going to try and build a model, and that's what this little table is. So if we see that there's two C's, I can note that in my table. So I've noted, I've got a C and there's a count of 2. Similarly for D, there are 2 Ds. Similarly for E, there are 2 E's, and there's just 1 F. So this is a model of how often Bach uses certain notes in this opening of the invention. Now what I want to do is use that model to generate new music. And I'm going to do this by using something called a random number. What's a random number? Well, a very simple example is the number you get when you throw dice. So if I throw a single die, I'll get a number between 1 and 6, but I won't know beforehand what it is. So we allocate random numbers to our notes. Because there are twice as many C's, D's, and E's as F, I've given 2 random notes, numbers each to C, D, and E, and just 1 to F. So I've allocated 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So what I actually did prior to this talk was use an 8-headed die to generate some random numbers, and I ignored all the 8s. Okay, so what happened during that process? So I generated a random number. I got a 2. From the table, we can see that 2, the random number 2 maps to C. Generate another random number, 7. From the table, that maps to F. We got another 7, so obviously that's going to map to F. We then had a 4, so that maps to D. We then had a 6, so that maps to E. We then had a 2, that maps to C. And then we had a 5, which maps to E. So I've generated 7 notes based on my model, which was constructed based on Bach's phrase. Let's now see what we've got. Oh, Byron? Okay, so that doesn't sound too bad. Thanks very much, Byron. So that doesn't sound too bad, but maybe it doesn't have the elegance of Bach. For example, I can't really describe this thing in terms of its structure quite so easily. And if we think about why that is, well, what I've done is I've modeled the way that Bach uses the notes in terms of their frequencies. What I haven't modeled is how Bach moves from note to note. And we saw earlier that Bach at the start goes up 1 at a time. So there's something there's something important about how we move between notes, not just how often we use the notes. So I want to take a second approach, and we're going to now model how we move from note to note. And so these differences between 2 notes are in music referred to as an interval. So we're going to model the intervals. So if we look at Bach's start of his invention, we start with a C, and then we go up 1 to D. And then we go up 1 to E. We go up 1 to F. We then fall to D. So if you think about it, we're falling down 2 places. We go up to 1, up 1 to E, and then we fall to C. So that's the intervals that Bach is using between his notes. And I'm going to build a model of that, kind of similar to what I did before. So we can see that there are 4 instances of +1. So I put that into my model. I've got +1 for a count of 4. And there are 2 instances of -2. So I put that in my table. I've got intervals of -2 that happen twice. Again, I'm going to use random numbers. Now we can see that there are twice as many +1s as -2s. So I can allocate twice as many random numbers to +1 as to -2. So I can use a standard die now and use the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so now let's try and generate some music from this model. What we need to do, because we're now working with intervals, we need to choose an initial note. So I'm going to choose to copy Bach I'm going to use the C as the first note. Now, you might think this is cheating, but this is probably what most composers would do. Composers frequently copy other people. Okay, so I generated some random numbers. I had a 2 from my table, that maps to -2. And -2 from my -2 takes from C down to A. Generated another random number, 5, that maps to +1. From A, that takes us to B. Another random number, 6, that takes us to +1, which takes us to C. Another random number, 5, that takes us to a +1, which takes us to D. We now have a 1, so that's a fall of -2 from our table. So that takes us down to B. We have a 4, which maps to +1, which takes us to C. Okay, so we've now got 7 notes. Byron, would you like to play this, please?
Sure, yeah, here's the original Bach, which was the model. And here's the randomly generated passage.
So again, we might not think that's maybe as good as Bach's, but what we do see is we've inherited some of his structure. Admittedly, there's an element of randomness to this, but we have got the A, B, C, D in the middle. So let's think about these 2 phrases that we've generated. And again, I've tried to draw them in a diagram. So at the top, you can see what I generated from the pictures model, and below is what I generated from the intervals model. Now, if I look at the intervals diagram, what I can see that gently rising section in the middle. So I'm able to kind of describe this structurally. If I look at the top, it's not so easy for me to find an easy kind of structural description of that. So what I want you to do now is we're going to listen to these 2 phrases, and I'd like you to think, which do you prefer? Why? And of course, there's no right or wrong answer. And then you might like to put your answers on the chat, and maybe we get to discuss those later on. So Byron, would you like to play the top phrase, please? And would you like to play the bottom phrase, please? If you just have those again. And then the bottom. Okay, so have a think about those, and maybe put something on the chat if you feel so inclined. Okay. So we've seen 2 ways that we can make music using a computer. Sorry, excuse me. Sorry, what I want to do now is think about whether that process I went through, which could easily be implemented on a computer, whether that process is really a creative process. So creativity is a very hard thing to tie down, but I want to spend some time thinking about it. What we're going to do is look at a model of creativity, some examples, and then think about some criteria which tell us whether a process really is creative. So we're going to work with Margaret Boden's model of creativity. Margaret Boden proposes that there are 3 ways a process can be creative. We can have an exploratory process, a combinational process, or a transformative process. And what I want to do now is look at some examples of those. Now, exploratory creativity is the idea that if you have a creative task, there's a range of possibilities open to you. So let's imagine somebody had said to me, well, can you give me an abstract picture of a triangle and a circle? Now, I have very little ability to paint pictures and so on. But in this case, what I could do is I could just lay out some of the possibilities. And that's what I've done here. So I've thought to myself, well, there are different ways I could arrange these things. Let's just try something. And the idea with exploratory creativity is we try different things until we get something that we like. Combinational creativity. Combinational creativity is the idea that if there are some existing ideas that we combine to create a new idea, then we've been creative because we've produced a new idea. So let's imagine in the 18th century, I was driving along on my horse and cart and I spied a steam engine. Now, if I thought to myself, oh, hang on, I could hook that steam engine up to my cart, get rid of the horse, then I would have invented a very simple early form of a car. So that's combinational creativity, bringing together existing ideas, but producing a new idea. Okay, transformative creativity. This is based on the notion that creativity is a form of game, so it has some sort of rules. So when we talked about Bach producing the start of his invention, I talked about the fact that he would probably restrict himself to a small set of notes and use some repetition. So you might see those as rules that help you to produce music a bit like Bach's music. If we change those rules, then we would get a new form of music. And by changing the rules of the game, we have transformative creativity. So another example would be, for example, the first person who, when they were playing football, picked up the ball and started running with it. By changing the rules of football, they would have effectively invented the game of rugby, which of course was invented not actually that far from here. Okay, so that's transformative creativity. What I want to do now is think about some musical examples of each of these forms of creativity. So let's imagine my task now is to produce a very short melody of 2 notes that only uses the notes C, D, E, and F. What I can do here is lay out a table with all the possibilities. So I can put the first note down the left-hand side of my table, the second note across the top. And then I can lay out these possibilities. And what I can do now, if I choose to, is work my way through. So I could play CC, see if I like it, play CD if I like it, until I find something I decide is what I want. An alternative approach, of course, is with this table was just to jump in. So I could say, oh, let's just try E, jump in the middle of the table and try EE. So this is the notion that we've got this space of possibilities. We talked about a range of possibilities before. Here we've seen it actually laid out in a 2-dimensional space. And we can search that space. And this is what a lot of AI is actually doing. So of course, for most real creative tasks, we don't actually explicitly lay out this space. That's not practical, but we've still got that notion of exploring that space. Okay, so combinational creativity. Remember, this is taking 2 ideas and pulling them together. So if we think about Bach's invention, he uses a very simple rhythm, but a quite interesting sequence of notes. Byron, would you like to play that, please?
Sure.
Thank you. Now, if we think of another piece of music a little bit later, Beethoven's Fifth, this has a very interesting rhythm, which I've tried to show in a little diagram. Byron, would you like to just play the start of that, please?
Sure. Sorry, I started in the wrong notes. There we go.
Okay, so very interesting rhythm there, maybe one of the most famous rhythms in kind of Western, certainly classical music. Now, what about if we try and take Bach's pitches and we take Beethoven's rhythm and put them together? What do we get then? Byron? Okay, so we've got something new. You may like that, you may not like it. But certainly the notion that you could try out different pitches against different rhythms is one way you can create music, and that's a form of combinational creativity. Okay, so I want to come on now to transformational creativity. Now, Schoenberg, a 20th century composer, often worked with something called a tone row. Now, a tone row is 12 notes where none of the notes is repeated. And Schoenberg, for example, bases his variations for orchestras on such a tone row. He uses the tone row and then again manipulates it a bit like Bach did with his invention in different ways to get his overall piece. So in some ways quite similar. Byron, would you like to play the tone row, please?
Sure.
Thank you very much. So if we think back to Bach then, Bach composes phrases by restricting the number of notes he uses and repeating. Schoenberg, when he uses the tone row, uses rather more notes in this example, 12 notes, and never repeats a note. So whoever invented the tone row approach, and there's some debate whether it was Schoenberg or Schoenberg and other people, but whoever is responsible for that has demonstrated transformational creativity. In Bach's time, music was very much about repetition. Schoenberg is very much saying within a single tone row, we don't do repetition, and we get some quite different sounding music. So I think this is a very good example of transformational creativity. Okay, so what we've seen now are quite a few creative processes. How do we know they're really genuinely creative? Okay, so for example, when I was generating music using a die, you might have said, well, that's not really creative, he's just throwing a die. But to think about that, we need to think about criteria. And what we can do is we can think about both the product of the creativity, what is produced, and the process we go through to get that product. So looking at the product, we would expect the product to be novel. If what we produce is similar to what someone else did, people would probably say, no, that's not creative. So maybe my phrase earlier that I generated passes that test. The notes were used quite differently in a way to the way Bach used them. What about value? So value is the idea that the product has some value to us. And of course, we know many works of art have an incredible amount of financial value, but we also expect them to have some sort of aesthetic value. If we go back to the notes I generated using a die, maybe they do have value. Maybe if I can generate a really interesting longer piece using those notes, we would say that was a very valuable sequence of notes we had there. Now let's think about process then. When a composer creates a piece of music, when they compose, they might have some procedures in mind that they follow, but if they find those procedures aren't successful, they will vary them or try something else. So we'd expect a composer to be reflecting upon what they did, thinking about making adjustments to their process. What I did earlier was pretty mechanical, so I wasn't really reflecting much. The other thing we expect the composer is intent. So if a composer is composing a piece of music, they're not just doing something random. They normally have some sort of rough goal in mind. So for example, they might want to create a happy piece of music, or they might want to create a sad piece of music, but they have some sort of intent about what they're trying to do. Now, arguably, it's very difficult for a computer, certainly today, to do reflection or intent. Those are things we very much associate with human beings. So maybe a much better approach is if we put the human in charge of the reflection and having intent, and the computer helps with some of the technical things that we want to do. I want to now think about that approach. That's an approach we've taken at the Open University, where we've built a tool called Open Melody. And what Open Melody allows us to do is to have a human and an AI agent collaborate on a creative task. So I'm just going to now come out of PowerPoint and do a little demo of the tool. Okay, so we can see here Open Melody. What this allows us to do is allows us to work with pitches and rhythms and then combine them. And then from those combinations, where we get some melodic phrases, we can build a complete melody. So this is working similarly to some of the processes I looked at earlier. We have a way of generating pitches, and indeed we have a way of generating rhythms, and we have a way of placing those together. So if I go to the pitch section of the tool, we can see we've got some generate keys. If I hit one of those, a pitch phrase gets generated. So by pitch phrase, I just mean a phrase where we have some pitches, but the rhythm is just very, very simple. So I can play that. Okay, so I can make a judgment now whether I like that or not. And I think that that's kind of okay. I'm going to generate a second pitch phrase and play that. Now, I think that's also okay. And I actually think it kind of goes with the first phrase. It seems sufficiently similar to fit, but sufficiently different, in my opinion, to give us a little bit more interest. Now let's generate a rhythm. Play the rhythm. Okay, so that sounds okay to me. I'm going to now generate a second rhythm. Play that. Okay, so I've now got some pitches and some rhythms that I'm interested in. Now I want to build those into phrases. So if I take pitch phrase 1 and select that, and take rhythm phrase 1 and select that, I can combine them. Now what I want to do is play the combination. Okay, but maybe not perfect, but I think that's interesting. I'm now going to try pitch phrase 2 against rhythm 1. The idea here is by using the same rhythm, we'll get some sort of consistency as well as some differences. I'm going to combine those and play them. Okay, now I'm just going to try pitch phrase 2 against rhythm 1. Play them. I actually quite like that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the decision that I've got enough material now for my complete melody. So I'm actually going to use full phrase 1 as the start, full phrase 2 as the second thing. And then for a bit of extra interest, we'll have full phrase 3. And I'm going to go back to full phrase 1 in an attempt to try and give some sort of ending that echoes the start. May or may not work well, I don't know. Let's try playing the whole thing now. Okay, so I find that kind of interesting. I'm not saying it's fantastic, and obviously it's up to you how you feel about what we've created there. Obviously, with a bit more time, we could play around a bit more and try all sorts of things. So that's open melody. The pitch section is using a process to what we looked at earlier. So we're exploring, the machine is generating stuff and we're saying whether we like it or not. The rhythm is done a bit differently. Actually, we use a library of rhythms because the process I used earlier, it turns out doesn't work quite so well for rhythm. And then we've got the combinational creativity, which again, we saw earlier being used in the tool. Okay, we haven't used the dislike buttons. The dislike buttons are a way of us telling the system if when something is generated, we don't like it. This allows the tool to build up an idea of what we like. And it knows what we like because it assumes if we use something later on, we like it. And if we press the dislike button, it then knows explicitly we dislike stuff. So the idea of this will learn the kind of thing we like over a period of time. Okay, I'm just now going to go back to PowerPoint. Okay, so I just want to very briefly cover the key ideas. The idea behind this tool was that we would support Boden's model of creativity. So that's the basis of our tool. And what we've seen is that we can explore pitch and rhythm phrases, and we can combine pitch and rhythm phrases. So we have both exploratory and combinational creativity. Now, transformative creativity is not directly supported, but because the tool actually is quite simple and quite limited, we're expecting that some users will come to the conclusion, there are things that I'd like to do that this tool wouldn't like to do, that this tool won't be able to do. And what we're hoping is that they'll be able to come up with suggestions about new versions of the tool that would be able to do those things. And in this way, they will be doing transformative creativity. They will actually be experiencing transformative creativity. Now, earlier we were generating bark using a die. A lot of users might say, well, I don't want to generate bark, I want to create my own music. So we haven't learned our model from particular music. What we've done is we've created a generic model, in some ways similar to what we did earlier, based on intervals, but we've kind of engineered that model based on what we know from the music literature. And as that model produces generic material, the user is giving feedback to the system about what they like and dislike, and we can use that to tailor the system. Okay, so that's open melody. So just to conclude, remember we were asking the question of, can a computer be creative? Well, I think that depends on your perspective, on how important you think the different criteria are. If you think reflection and intent is important, then I think that casts some doubt on this. Of course, in the future, maybe computers can reflect and maybe even have intent. I mean, that's a very open and controversial question. But for us, at this moment in time, human AI collaboration is kind of more promising and more interesting because we can actually learn about creativity and we can enhance human creativity. And that's the path we've gone down with open melody. And that's the path we're hoping to be pursuing for a number of years. At the moment, the tool is relatively new. So I'd like to conclude by thanking my collaborators, in particularly Raymond Hawley, who implemented open melody and made lots of great suggestions. A number of my PhD students and colleagues have also contributed ideas over quite a few years. And of course, thank you very much to Byron for playing the piano. It's been really great to have you, Byron. And here are just a few links to a YouTube demo of the tool, a link where you can get the software, my homepage, and my list of publications. A lot of those publications relate in one way or another to the journey we took to arrive at this particular tool. And just finally, thank you very much for listening to this talk. You can now If you have questions, you now send them in using the comments. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, hopefully everyone's still with me. I'm just going to get some questions from the comments. Okay, so I'm being fed text, and so I'll be reading some stuff out. So I'm going to start by reading a comment, and Katrina says, it was a tie. People liked A and B equally. A few people mentioned that A and B complemented each other. They sounded like a question and answer. Well, I think that's a really, really interesting result. I really like that. So it might be, if we've got a question and an answer there, lots of music is based on that kind of pattern, of course. So maybe these two things would be a good way of generating a longer piece. Okay, so I'm now going to go to a question. In regards to the open melody, is it possible to output the melody from the open melody program as music notation or MIDI output? Very good question. So the tool natively inside at the moment works with the MIDI notation, very well known music notation. And the save button, which I didn't demonstrate, will allow you to save the melody, the mid as MIDI. That MIDI can then be opened in something, for example, like the free software MuseScore. So we're very happy if people want help taking the output from this and using it in their notation programs. Very happy to help with that. It's relatively simple, simply because we use the very common MIDI format. So where can I find open melody is the next question. So on my homepage, there's a link to the YouTube video. The YouTube video has a link to the Open University's research database, and in the research database is the software. At the moment, the software requires you to download another piece of software called Processing, but we're working to produce a version that can actually just be used in a web browser. So you might, if you want to find out what's happening with Open Melody, the best place might be to look from time to time, either at my, well, probably at my homepage, because I'll tell the story of the different versions and let you know when a browser version is available. Okay, so the next question is, what does Byron think of the melodies generated by Open Melody? Are you still there, Byron?
Yeah, I'm still here. Um, they they seemed much more along the lines of the kind of the random kinds of melodies that the first melody that you generated using dice. They seemed much more along those lines than they seemed along the lines of the more shaped melody that you generated by manipulating the intervallic content. So it seemed to me that that some of them lacked a kind of sense of direction or trajectory that I suspect even Schoenberg was building into his tone row, say, in particular ways, in manufacturing that tone row. So I think I'd probably spend quite a bit of time moving between like and unlike in Open Melody, and I doubtless have lots of strong opinions there.
Thank you very much, Byron. Very interesting. So yes, so the generative model that we have does use some principles from music. So, for example, you'll notice that some notes get repeated, which a human composer would sometimes do, and indeed some sequences get repeated. But it's very much an open research project for us to work on engineering that model to give something maybe a little bit more like the Bach, or indeed a little bit more like the Schoenberg. So one thing that would interest us, for example, would maybe to produce different versions of the tool that produce particular types of music and was maybe a little bit more successful than the tool currently is at those forms of music. Now, the idea actually is that I shared the tool very quickly, but if I was really using this tool, I would have probably generated more melodies and waited till I got one that was a bit more like something that had structure. But it's very much an open area of research for us to draw on music theory and to improve the way the melodies are produced. Okay, so I've got a comment. Thanks, Robin and Byron. Would be interesting to apply a weighting to the choice of pitch interval. Okay, so the current model actually does have some weighting, but based on Byron's comments, which I think are very helpful, we probably haven't gone far enough. So yes, we need to play more with those weightings. At the moment, the weightings tend to restrict the music. So rather than jumping about, most of the intervals are quite small, and some of them are larger. Okay, so when we saw Bach's thing, for example, he moved by step in part of the place, and we've tried to emulate that, but I think we've got further to go. So this is very much work in progress. So we've then got a question: how can the algorithm adapt itself instead of you saying like or not? Okay, so that's really interesting. So our idea is that human beings are good at aesthetic choice. And so us providing feedback just seems a very kind of pragmatic thing to do because it puts the user in charge. If we want the algorithm to adapt itself, then the algorithm needs to have some knowledge of some sort of music aesthetics or music theory. Indeed, well, actually, I think it needs to have some sort of notion of aesthetic. So there's lots of work actually that does this. So there's lots of work that takes an evolutionary approach to music. But the problem is if you allow the music to evolve, if you say the music is allowed to evolve, but you don't involve human aesthetics, what you'll get is music that probably doesn't reflect human aesthetics. Now, it might be you're interested in what the machine would like. So maybe the machine evolving its own aesthetic is something that's of interest to you. And indeed, there are people who take that perspective. So there are lots of perspectives. The extent to which the machine evolves its own aesthetic, if you can really call it an aesthetic, and the way we get feedback from users and work collaboratively is a whole kind of very wide, interesting area. Okay, so I've got a comment. Rodney from the U3A says, thanks, Robin. The University of the Third Age is standing by. So this is a reference to the fact that we're going to be working with the University of the Third Age to look at both the use of this tool and actually how people can do their own science using this tool. So we're hoping to use this tool to do citizen science. So we're planning a project where people both use this tool, but also think about their use of it and start thinking, what does it mean scientifically to create music with a collaborative tool? What sort of questions can we ask? What sort of answers can we come up with? So thanks very much, Rodney. I'm very much looking forward to working with the University of the Third Age. And I think it's going to be a really great thing for the OU to be forming some really strong collaborations with you. Okay, I've got a question. Any research underway into making contrapuntal compositions rather than just melody? I'm very, very pleased you asked this. This work was partly inspired by another project I had, which is to create contrapuntal music. So music where we have several lines of melody working against each other and where those lines form harmony over a period of time. So we used Bach's first invention as examples in this talk. Bach's Bach created a whole set of those inventions, and I think they're really fascinating because there's so much going on. They're really short pieces, but in many ways they echo a lot of what happens, or maybe rather a lot of his other work echoes what happens in those inventions. So I think they're a really interesting set of pieces to look at. And I think they're really interesting because you can look at them and kind of work out what's going on. So what we'd like to do is, or another project we'd like to do, is to use machine learning to be able to generate inventions. And the idea we had was that we could learn from the start of each invention, where we have, the core of the invention, and then we could try and learn how Bach goes from his start of invention to the rest of the piece. So we could learn that process. So we could kind of have a two-part approach where we look at how do you get the initial start of the invention, then how do you generate the whole piece from that. So that's very much something that we're hoping to do. Next week, we are presenting a paper at a conference, and that paper is on how to create the subjects of Bach's inventions using machine learning. So subject is another word, really roughly speaking, for that start of the invention. So if you're interested in learning contrapuntal music, I'd very much encourage you to have a look at that paper. It will be on our research paper repository very soon. And if you have any problems, just get in contact. Next question. Is there a way to create a feedback system for the algorithm so it can validate its own creations, like seen in GAN networks? I think the answer to this is yes. It's something I'd like to think about a bit more before I really commit myself. But one of the things we have with these statistical models is, as well as being able to generate a piece of music, having generated a piece of music using the model, we can use the model to say how closely the model matches the music. So if we, for example, think about the first model I used, it said really C is going to be used more times than F on average, right? So if we created a piece of music and actually that music had lots of Fs, we can look at it, we can compare it against the model and say, well, actually, it's not very typical of the model. That can happen. So we can use these models, statistical models, both as a way of generating music and as a way of judging music. So yes, we can kind of do a GAN network type system. Okay, so I think that's the end of the questions. Thank you very, very much for watching this talk. The talk will be available on the STEM YouTube and Facebook pages. I've really enjoyed this. I've really enjoyed having Byron working with me. Thank you, Byron.
Thanks, Robin.
Thanks, Byron. And I gave you some links earlier. If you have questions that I haven't answered today, or you want to get in contact about the research, I'm very, very happy to take emails on this work. This is work we're going to be doing over several years, and hopefully we're also going to be working on Bach's inventions and working on contrapuntal generation as well. So thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thanks, Robin. I'm guessing that's the end of the feed. I suppose we'll see if this shows up at the end.